Thank you for everyone that's here today. Steve Jobs, who I've studied for years, has often said that design is the constant act of problem solving, because he thought a lot about design. He also said design isn't how it looks, it's how it works. I say all of this because I've been thinking design-wise about how we can avoid burnout, produce more productive team member outcomes, and drive more value by being more empathetic about what we see in workplace. This goes all the way back to 2003. 2003, I had noticed that some of my best people weren't quite right. We had powered through the dot-com crash while Lycos and Excite and others fell by the wayside. We seem to have powered through. In particular, Holt Lyda, who was not a programmer, he was a marketing ops person. His personality had changed. He started to miss days. He started to become cynical, which was really weird for him. He was very sunny. I'd see him in the hallways. I'm like, Holt, how's it going? And he would say, another day in paradise. I mentioned this to one of my new friends I met in the Silicon Valley, Dr. Terry Real. He ran the HeartMath Research Institute. HeartMath is a leading organization that studies stress in the workplace. Terry and I conferred about the idea that many people in technology might be suffering burnout for a variety of reasons. So we employed a study, over 3,000 professionals, mostly in knowledge work and software. And in late 2003, we released the findings where Terry Real coined a phrase called New Economy Depression Syndrome. You can Google it, New Economy Depression Syndrome. You'll read all of the research that started in 2003 and in fact made the Wired jargon list by 2004, being shortened to NEDS, but here's the idea. We studied people that spent a lot of time on screens, 5 hours a day on the average. This is back in 2003. And we learned that when people experience constant interruption, information overload, the equivalent of reading a New York Times issue cover to cover every day at work, and a decrease in human interaction, they suffered from workplace depression. Since then, I've continued to study the issues of burnout in the workplace. 2019, prior to joining Upwork, I was hired by the largest healthcare system in New York to produce wellness seminars for doctors on how they can deal with burnout. Not only did they have increased caseloads and deal with Affordable Health Care Act, more importantly, electronic medical records had created this NEDS phenomenon throughout the medical care industry. So starting in 2019, my team and I did deep research on burnout, and it brings me to today. When I joined Upwork, I joined because I've always been a design thinker. And when I looked at what Upwork did to provide freelancers and contractors to enterprises, I realized there could be a design hack around the corner. My scenario was, if there is a recession, this is going to be a huge solution. But here we are, a year into the pandemic, and I want to talk to you about burnout in the context of your employees, what it means to the value of your enterprises. And I'm going to employ design thinking to help you get in front of the two key drivers of burnout, which is stress and a depletion of energy. So the first thing I learned when I started to do a lot of research about burnout is that it's different than what most people think it is. So I want to use my favorite definition, Christina Maslach, who I believe is the world's expert on burnout in the workplace. She defines burnout as a work-related malady with three characteristics. These are three things you'll see: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, think cynicism, and a perception of reduced personal accomplishment. People begin to feel like they're not doing well at work. But here's what I really want you to dial in on. It occurs because of an improper relationship between people and their workplaces. You shouldn't call it work-life balance. That's not what it's about. There is no such thing as work-life balance. Dr. Maslach would say it's about work-life integration. The key to avoiding burnout is to make sure that people have a proper relationship with their work. Now, I mentioned before, I've done a lot of research in the healthcare industry. Here's an example of how Dr. Drummond's a famous researcher about workplace stress and burnout. He looks at it this way. He said it's this combination of stresses in your practice and personal life that drain you, and it runs your internal energy account below zero into a negative balance. So the first takeaway I really want to drive home here is that there is a precarious relationship balance, not a work-life balance, a relationship balance between a person and their work. And when it gets out of balance, they get drained below zero and they experience burnout. I'm going to talk mostly about enterprise issues, impact to enterprise, what enterprise can do about it. But the physiological and the psychological impacts of burnout are horrible on people. No, first of all, they lose a lot of sleep. They are likely to have higher blood pressure. They are more likely to have alcohol and drug abuse. They are significantly more likely to have breakups in their personal relationships. And then finally, they're more likely to experience ongoing depression, which can also lead to gastrointestinal issues. It can also lead to heart disease. I think the key, though, is to understand what are some of the symptoms that you should be looking for in terms of burnout. So I'll go through just a few of those with you right now. You'll see increased conflict. Now, the conflict we've been noticing over remote work is much more nuanced than the kind of conflict we probably saw around the office. It's mostly eye rolling, other forms of incivility. You'll notice that people begin to obsess over the negative things that happened during events, meetings, interactions, etc. You'll notice some of your best people becoming absolute perfectionists, right? And remember, perfect is the enemy of good. It gets ahead of shipping things on time. They might have a real hair trigger for anxiety. Little things set them off. They talk about the negative often. So they express cynicism. I mentioned before, Holt Lida always would look at me and say, just another day in paradise. And then you'll notice a high dissatisfaction with their career. Fortunately, I mentioned before Dr. Maslow, there's a really good way to have people fill out a simple inventory to really determine the level of burnout. So it can be scientifically ascertained. I really think this is right up there with Myers-Briggs in terms of how much time and effort's been put into the Maslow burnout inventory. It's something you can absolutely measure and try to get ahead of. And this is one of the things I want to emphasize. You want to get ahead of burnout. You don't want to respond to burnout, because most of the researchers talk about early stage burnout, mid-stage burnout, and critical stage burnout, which is almost irreversible. So the more we can get ahead of the problem, the easier it is for us to maintain productivity, to maintain employee retention, and a lot of the other enterprise issues I'm about to talk about. But it's time for us to take our second poll. This is one where you as leaders will think about your own people. So what percentage of your employees do you believe are currently experiencing burnout? You see there are 4 answers there. Please fill that out. Let's give it just a few more seconds. Okay, Christina, what were the results? 40 to 60%.
Yeah, 40 to 60%.
40 to 60%. Well, I got good news for you. If that's true, then you're below the average. Let me show you some statistics here on the level of burnout. Okay, here we go. Gallup organization studied this. They did a research panel late 2014. They released it in 2016. It was about 23%, about 1 out of 4. And by the way, Gallup measures it like rarely, sometimes, often, always, that kind of thing. So this is an often thing. I feel it often. It was about 23% when they released a 2016 study. 2019, which studied like late 2017, that number jumped, and it jumped alarmingly to almost 30%. Okay, pretty bad, right? Well, guess what? When it comes to burnout today, this is a crisis. Spring Health just recently did a December 2020 research piece with the Harris poll. And using the phrase often, I feel burned out at work, the number has skyrocketed to 78%. Now, if you think that's high, it is. 300% jump. Now, we've seen jumps like this before. Research on burnout showed a dramatic jump when they studied it in late 2008 after the Great Recession. Previous researchers have studied workplace dissatisfaction in 2003 and 2004, saw similar jumps. The Globe and Mail did a 30,000 person survey just last week. And that was mostly North America, a lot of US participants, and they kind of verified the same thing. It came in at around 83%. So the jump's big. There's a lot of reasons to explain why the jump is so big. So by the way, the Spring Hill research looked at it, and women indexed at 80%, men at 70%, but when they looked at women 18 to 44, it was 87%. There's a lot of reasons this is the case. The main reason is increased workload. I'll talk about that later on. Hiring freezes, reduction in forces, budget freezes. A lot of people are just doing more work. And a lot of people are taking on more work because they're working remote and worried that their production or contribution is not seen like it was visibly seen in an office environment. So the overcompensation factor is dramatic. There's people that are suffering from pandemic stress, which is its own bag of problems. And as you'll see later on, there are other stressors at work because of poor workplace design for remote work and poor workplace design for those bringing people back to the office. Now, most researchers would say there is a tremendous loss in the billions to corporations just like yourself because of burnout. Now, Insurance Business Magazine estimated in 2019, based on the Gallup research, that companies were losing between 125 and 190 billion dollars. It is safe to say today that the total loss looks like $500 billion in 2021. But what I want to focus on to really be the motivation to think about starting this design thinking process to avoid burnout, get ahead of burnout, resolve it hopefully only at mid-stage, I want to isolate enterprise impacts. And I think a little bit about how this really affects a company's ability to continue to grow and continue to produce value. These are the enterprise impacts I want to isolate: absenteeism, performance, and retention. Gallup's 2019 study found that people that are experiencing burnout often are 63% more likely to take sick days. Absenteeism, we've been measuring at the end of 2020, is at an all-time high. And absenteeism is a funny thing in a remote working environment because people don't say, I'm going to not come into the office day and be sick. You'll have a variety of ways people decide not to come to work. One of the most common ways for those who are using products like G Suite is what we call the Costanza markout. The Costanza markout basically says I turn my privacy setting on so you can only see that I'm busy, and I fill my calendar up for the day because I'm just so burnt out I can't deal with it. That's an example of absenteeism, but it's on the rise, and it makes a huge impact on your ability to produce good work. I also think about performance, and I call out a statistic here: 13% are less confident on the job. Why is that important? Because when you feel less confident for the job, it dramatically affects your engagement, it affects your communication quality, it affects your ability to take any kind of constructive feedback, but most importantly, it keeps you from shipping the work. So this lowered confidence, which is a function of burnout, really does affect productivity. But here's the last thing I want to talk about here that I think is really important. And that is, according to the research by Gallup, people experiencing burnout are 260% more likely to change jobs. That is a real challenge, especially when you think about how hard it was for you to get those talents in the first place. Now, I mentioned before that we've been looking a lot at late 2020 research. Eagle Hill Consulting just released something, HR Executive published it, and what they found is that 25% of people currently in knowledge work will likely quit their jobs post-pandemic. Now just stop and think about that for a second. That's 1 out of 4. Many of them have delayed making job changes in the last year because of their perception of a tight market, a recession. Maybe the next employer won't let them work at home and they're kind of freaked out about having to go back into the office, et cetera. The floodgates will open. And if you think this number is inflated, Towers Perrin studied this in 2008 and 2004, and we saw mass movement amongst talent. especially what I like to call that second 10% of your performers. So you've got your top 10% of your performers who are usually very invested in the team. You've probably given them a lot of equity grants, raise, compensation bumps, et cetera. But there's that 10% just below them, and they're still good performers. They probably are people that you would put in between meets and exceeds expectations. Those are the ones that know they're good enough to get a different job. Those are the ones that are likely to leave. And the weirdest thing about this isn't that they go necessarily to a company that has a better employership brand. They just want to reset. Many of you have probably been seeing this in the last year, where some of your best people have left with no new job lined up. The idea of grown people taking skip years has really emerged in 2020 and early 2021 as a threat to business continuity. And when you think about some of your best programmers, your best marketing specialists, this is something you definitely want to get in front of. So I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about how we can employ design thinking, the constant act of problem solving, to reduce the likelihood of burnout or to get ahead of it while it's still either early or mid-stage. Now, I mentioned before, design thinking, I think, is the solution to this, to take a look at the problem, take a look at its root cause, and to think about how we can change two key areas to make sure there's less burnout. I'll just start, though, with a story that I think will bring this home for you. Years and years ago, I met Dr. Jim Goodnight. He's the founder of SAS Institute. They're a business analytics software company. For years and years, they've been known as the richest privately held software company in the world. You probably know them from Fortune's 100 Best Companies to Work For list. If you looked at their average ranking over the last 20 years, it's 9. They've been number 1 several times. Here's the story. Dr. Goodnight almost went to work for IBM, which he says stands for I've been moved. That's a reorg joke. But he said he almost went to work for IBM, graduating from North Carolina State. He studied statistics and computer science. He's a real brainiac. But he noticed when he went into interview that everybody that worked there had slumped shoulders. They looked down. He said that he realized very quickly that it was a treadmill for human beings. He decided not to join IBM, and instead he and 2 other agricultural researchers started SAS Institute, pretty much bootstrapped it to really create an analytics solution for the agricultural industry. It became a huge company. I think today they probably have about 13,000 employees worldwide. But his entire philosophy around SAS was to design an organization that had a competitive value proposition around the worker experience. Even 60 Minutes did an expose on all of the design acumen that SAS put into the workplace experience. Fresh flowers everywhere, an artist in residence, fresh fruit brought in every day, on-site medical care before that was a thing. Families could come have lunch with employees. But the biggest one he talked about was the idea that if you worked at SAS, you never worked evenings or weekend. In fact, they prohibited email or text-based conversations after work, and even did designs that if somebody was on vacation or FMLA, they were out of the loop on context, purposefully creating a new way of thinking about what it took to attract people to an organization. But let me tell you how you can use that SAS Institute mentality to really think about the design of your firm. So one of the things I found out right away in the research is that the secret to avoiding burnout regarding a profession, so it doesn't matter which kind of profession you're in, the secret really comes down to designing for 2 things. Number 1, reduce stress. Number 2, recharge energy. If we design to reduce the stress and to recharge the energy, then a person has an integration between work and life. They have a proper relationship with their job. They do not feel burned out. The opposite, they feel inspired. One of the things that's really important about inspiration, a person feeling that sense of purpose, that sense of possibility, that sense of engagement, is it also changes their chemical flow. Now, when a person lives in a high stress, burned out environment, their body typically produces cortisol, the stress hormone. That's what leads to all the physiological complications I talked about earlier. But what most people don't know is that when you produce cortisol, it lowers your brain leverage capacity. You've probably heard that on the average, we can leverage 10% of our brain. Hey, that's just an average, not even a medium. There's a huge range here. The research shows that when you're experiencing cortisol flow, your brain leverage capacity drops down to around 3% at the bottom. And that's going to create cognitive errors, more conflict, mistakes that you shouldn't be making, low quality output. What they found, though, is that people that have a recharged sense of energy in a low stress environment that feel inspired and engaged can leverage 30% of their brain's capacity. As a matter of fact, Eric Schmidt once at Google was talking about the competition with Yahoo. Google studied SaaS. As a matter of fact, Larry Page spent months on the SaaS campus in Cary, North Carolina, when they were super early stage as a company. Google designed employee experience into their DNA. Eric Schmidt once remarked that the reason they so soundly beat my former company, Yahoo, was that it was, quote, chemical warfare. And now you know what that means. So let's talk a little bit about how we reduce stress, but I want to really isolate, what is design thinking? Because I mentioned it several times. So when I talk to you as leaders of an organization, regardless of your function, you might be a department leader, you might be a center of excellence leader, you might be a human resource executive. I want you to think of it as a process, and it starts with define. The most important thing you have to do is find the root cause of stress in your organization, and it may be bespoke to your own culture. Once you find the root causes, and I'm going to show you how in just a second, then you want to put yourself into the shoes of the actual subject you're studying. In this case, your employee. Empathy is a huge lever for design. All great design puts the user's emotional experience at the center of the equation. Then the idea is to then think about different ideations, different solutions, create prototypes for them. At IDEO Labs, or a consultancy that comes up with innovation, there's a saying, I'm sure you've heard this, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. So you want to create a prototype, you want to test it, you want to measure the results, because when you do all of that, you will be able to roll out in solutions that may to scale create not only a lower burnout atmosphere, but a real value proposition in the age of musical chairs that is about to begin. So let's just start this process of design thinking. There's different types of stress. Now, that's what I want you to think about in terms of defining the root cause of what you might have in terms of stress on the job at work. There's time stress. That's a big one. That's why, and I mean time in terms of workload, like how much time do I have to do my work? There's anticipatory stress, like the stress that I've had getting ready for this presentation over the last week and a half. You have those situations where you anticipate and you run simulations, creates a lot of stress. There's the actual situations that you have at work, your meetings, your interactions with other people. Then there's the encounters. Encounter stresses have to do with the human relationship, sometimes filled with conflict, sometimes filled with constructive feedback, which is often considered negative. And then I'll just add one more based on my own research, and that's informational stress, information overload, and a constant state of interruption. Now, once you understand the stress types, then there's an exercise that you can start. We're going to give you a lot of follow-ups here. You're going to get an article written by an Upwork freelancer, and the article will bring together everything that I'm telling you, because I also record what I'm doing for you now. We have a Upwork freelancer that will transcribe it, a separate editor that will integrate what the analyst freelancers have put together for the research I presented to you, and give you back an article, including the following template and a link to a video on how to use this. This is something I've been doing since the mid-1980s. It's called the fishbone exercise. It is a way for a team to collaboratively define the different root causes behind a problem, so that they can create an innovation roadmap of what do we deal with first, second, third, and fourth. It was a critical piece of the quality movement, and it started out of Ishikawa, and Ishikawa was at Kawasaki, and he realized there's never a single cause behind a problem. There are also often multiple causes. And so here's an example of where we create 6 categories of stress drivers, like what creates stress in your organization. It could be workload, it could be workplace, it could be technology, it could be people and how they interact with each other. Think of your culture. It could be the processes by which you do business, and then the environment by which we work in, whether it's marketplace competition, the specter of the pandemic, or even leadership style. this is a great way for your team to come together and fill out each one of these, because there could be different issues in terms of workplace design. There could be different issues in terms of technology. And what the team can do is populate this fishbone as best they can, and then ask themselves, what is existential? In other words, what's the first thing we need to address? What's the second thing we need to address? What's the third thing we need to address? That's how you create an innovation roadmap of how to tackle the root cause of a problem using design thinking. Now, one of the ways to think about how you approach reduction of stress is to look at it from an empathetic point of view. That's the second piece of design thinking. I mentioned before Spring Health Research, they did the Harris poll. Well, they asked workers, what do you need to reduce burnout? So let me show you what they said. They said, I need to have less hours. I need more time off. They also talked about things which ranked very highly about I need more support from my manager and I need better mental health policies. This is a good jumping off point. Now, I always believe that you have to use testing and rapid experimentation to really close the loop on what people tell you in surveys to make sure they haven't been guided by the questions. But I think this is a really good place for us to start. So let's talk about how we can design work for less stress. There's 4 things I'm going to talk about: load management, leadership style, emotional alignment, and workplace design. But before we get into that, Christina, let's launch our final poll for this session. Simple question. Would you say that your team members are experiencing a higher workload than pre-pandemic? Yes or no? This might be because of a hiring freeze, a hiring reduction, a reduction of force, a maintaining a consistent level of output despite having less team members involved. Answer the question yes or no. I'll talk to you a little bit about why that's important. Yes, well, that's absolutely correct. And when we look across the norms, yes, it is estimated that almost 9 out of 10 managers would say the people that work for me have a lot more workload. Now, this is important because workload is more important than the hours people put in, according to the Gallup research. But there's a piece of research, you'll read about it in the follow-up article, from an organization called Mequilibrium. They use neuroscience as well as survey technology to really get to the heart of workplace design. They found out that information workers, like the people that work for you, that have an increased workload are 400% more likely to experience stress, 200% more likely to experience burnout. One of the most important things we can do for people is to give them load management. And what we mean by load management is a few things. So the first thing we've got to do is we've got to help people talk about how much bandwidth they have left. I've talked to organizations that have actually gamified it. So, you know, when you're playing a video game, certain games have an energy level. So you could see that the person's at 80% energy, 60% energy, they're down to 10% energy. Self-reporting, especially safe for programmers, to talk about the bandwidth they have left and make that a dashboard view is a great way for you to think about load management. In sports, I think a lot about sports. You see a football behind me. I'm definitely a sports fanatic. It's a great way for me to recharge my energy and get away from too much work. They talk a lot about pitch count, you might remember. So that started in baseball. A person might have a Tommy John injury, so we put him on a pitch count so he doesn't re-injure himself. You'll hear that all the time about quarterbacks that might be coming back from a rotator cuff injury, being on a pitch count. You need to do the same thing with your best people that begin to show the symptoms of burnout, where you purposely take work off of their plate in an effort to load manage them. This is something you're going to have to really work on as individual managers, or as leaders. You're going to have to cascade this down to the organization, but more of an awareness and an active design approach to create more load management for your best people is one of the best ways to get ahead of burnout and improve your employership brand. Now, I work at Upwork. I joined Upwork in January of 2020 because I took a design viewpoint towards where I thought the world was going. I made a bet that a recession had to be coming at some point, and if it did, then people would have too much workload, and that organizations like Upwork, we're a huge platform for freelancers and contractors, we'd be critical for load management. And this is something that we've been seeing. It started around July of this year. For those of you that have followed Upwork, it's a huge part of our rapid growth. We're growing 30% year over year. Sometimes we're seeing growth in the 20% in singular quarters of enterprise use. And right now, the majority of it is where people are using our marketplace of talent to load balance their team. And what they're focusing on is how to use our technology platform. And Christina, I know you've introduced us across the portfolio to use our technology platform, our solution designers who can help you find the use cases in the organization where you can use us for load management. Talent services can ensure the quality. The idea here is you want to do everything you can using freelancers and contractors to ensure that your team members are spending the majority of their time working on their core work, not all the ancillary work they've had to pick up over the last year. For example, we have organizations that say we want our software developers to really be focusing on specifically on code, not data annotation, not at writing code documentation, increasingly having to make explainer videos for rollouts, either for internal user populations or externally for customers. So it's a real question of designing for core work and then everything outside of that core moving out to what I call the talent cloud. And this is a great example for me to talk about here. So even when I think about what you're seeing as an output today, my core role is synthesis and presentation. That's what I do. My job is to take literature review, conduct empirical research, take a look at if everything comes together, present it to clients like yourself, and hopefully add a little value. As a result, I have 13 freelancers that are working for me right now. So for example, all the research that was done to refresh me on 2020 and 2021 was done by an Upwork analyst. We had a secondary researcher that also took a look at how to combine the different pieces of research to create a consistent narrative that I'm giving you today. I had a presentation designer. I use a remote producer. He's a freelance that used to work in television. He sets this room up for me, including the camera, the lighting, everything I do to produce the output. I have a transcriber that's going to take this recording, hand it to a freelance editor who's going to produce the article we deliver to you. The point is, Upwork has thoughtfully given me a way to load balance my own work life so that I feel like I can control my ability to work on my core work. So that's one of the most important things I want you to take away from this presentation. But continuing on, there's other issues. Leadership style is a big one. I mentioned before overcompensation. Employees are working too hard and burning themselves out because they're not physically present, and they worry that you don't see their work. So one of the most important things you can do in leadership style, there's a couple of things here, is first of all, maintain weekly one-on-ones. It's never been more important for you to give 10 minutes to your direct reports every week, preferably on Monday. Those one-on-ones don't have to be a Zoom. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. In fact, research says the best one-on-ones are just good old-fashioned phone calls. But I'm going to go sit on that couch over there, so I'm paying 100% attention. I'm not going to multitask in front of a computer. The one-on-one conversation should focus on outcomes and resources. What we find is that when you lead remote talent, and even after the pandemic, hopefully you continue to work with the global resource and not be constrained to your office zip codes. When you work with remote talent, you have to learn to manage based on outcomes, not attendance and attitude and aptitude. Outcomes-based leadership takes time to develop as a leader. You have to be extremely clear about what an outcome looks like. You have to have a cadence where you can help people manage time and effort towards an outcome. And those weekly one-on-ones help people decide how to prioritize their work so they can deliver the outcome that you clearly enunciated. And in that one-on-one, you're also asking them, what resources do you need to succeed at delivering the outcome? And by the way, matchmaking across the enterprise during this work from home environment is one of the biggest ones. But the most important thing I tell you about your leadership style is you have to lead with the check-in. You have to ask people, how's it going? And leave that pregnant pause. Because they always will give you a headline and withhold the body copy, but if you hang in there And if you open your eyes during those Zoom calls you choose to have and watch their face and watch their level of engagement as a leader, you can get ahead of this, catch burnout in an early stage. So I think that what we have to understand is that the leader's role today is to think about the emotional experience of the worker. There's a great article written by Dr. Daniel Goleman. He wrote the book Emotional Intelligence. The article is published in Harvard Business Review. Just Google it. It's called Primal Leadership. He studied how the mood state affects a company's value creation. He found that you could predict future cash flow of an organization by being able to measure the average mood of the average employee, because when the mood goes south, so does performance. So as leaders, he says, we have to think about mood state. We have to think about getting in front of burnout as one of our core objectives in how we produce value in an organization. Emotional alignment's the next thing I want to talk about. Emotional alignment is how you prevent conflict in an organization. Conflict is one of the 4 biggest drivers of burnout. Biggest driver right now is workload. Second driver is informational insecurity. In other words, I can't really figure out what's going on. That's why I overcompensate. A lack of fairness is number 3. But this issue of conflict is a really big deal in organizations. And as people have burnout, it kind of puts you in a vicious cycle. Burnout leads to conflict, conflict leads to burnout. It becomes a crisis. There's a lot of research on incivility that says you can have low-level conflict. Simple things, rolling your eyes, not showing up to Zoom meetings, et cetera, when people need you to be there, et cetera, that are forms of conflict which produce a lot of stress in an organization. So emotional alignment means that you try to bring people together around common values and objectives so they can understand why they might disagree, why they might go in different directions. One of the best examples of emotional alignment was actually something that has popped up at Ford Motors, and it's a very simple philosophy that came right down from their CEO, and it's called assume best intentions. And they talk about it a lot in organizations. They go, you need to assume that other managers you work with are operating under the best intentions, just with different objectives. And as you know, across centers of excellence, objectives don't always align with each other. Objectives sometimes clash, they compete for resources, but you can align people emotionally by focusing them on the values, on the mission that the company's on, or focusing them on the concept of forgiveness, that we've got to learn to look through all things that happen in an organization that don't go to our liking through this lens of compassion, where we understand people are operating under the best intentions. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about, though, is workplace design, because I think this is an area where we really can dramatically improve the ability to have less stress. I want to give you 7 ideas very quickly for better remote work by design. One of the things I've been studying since last March is remote work. I studied it pre and post pandemic. And I'm telling you, remote work absolutely does work for a lot of people, but it could work a lot better. And also we could make remote work much less stressful. So let's talk about some of the things we need to do. Number 1, we need to reduce meetings. I'm talking Zooms, I'm talking video-based meetings, I'm talking Teams. Video conferencing is extremely stressful, okay? Zoom fatigue is real. Let me just give you a little hack just to show you how design thinking works. You see yourself like over here on your left, you probably see yourself, right? And if you hover over yourself, you see how the mute blue button comes on the upper right. You see those little 3 dots? And if you click on those 3 dots, look at the bottom one, hide self-view. That's one of the things I do every time I start a meeting, is I go right in and I hide self-view. And one of the reasons I hide self-view is because it's very stressful for us to see ourselves. As a matter of fact, one researcher said that video conferencing is like having a meeting in 2018 in a conference room when your conversational attendees all have 4-inch by 5-inch mirrors on their forehead, okay? Zoom meetings are fatiguing. We don't have to use a Zoom for everything. Video meetings are best used when you need to collaborate, or there's emotional content, or there's a visual component to that meeting that's required. Otherwise, really take advantage of things like Slack and Chatter. Use good old-fashioned phone calls, as I talk about a little bit later. We've learned actually that people are better listeners. This is surprising. They're better listeners over phone because they dial into the auditory cues, which they can decode with much more accuracy. So we need to reduce meetings, not only the volume of the meetings, but the number of the Zoom meetings. So I really want you to make a meeting beg for its life. There's a great book called Brave New Work. Aaron Dignan wrote this book. He's helped companies cut meetings by 50%. It usually starts with a meeting moratorium that helps them understand they can get by without meetings. We need to reduce the length of meetings. When you do have a Zoom, understand that a 20-minute Zoom stand-up is the same as a 1-hour stand-up you used to do in conference rooms. Research supports this. I mentioned before, turn off self-view. That's another great way. Let's pass that along to people that we do meetings with. I want to talk a little bit about a buddy system. This is something that I read about in remote work research. There's a couple of books on this. Teresa Douglas wrote a great book on leading distributed teams. And here's the idea. People used to have a great social operating system around the office. They had a lot of chance conversations in break rooms and lunch rooms. They established peer relationships. Those constant peer check-ins improved their chemical flow, their feeling of personal security, their ability to vent and offload stress. And buddy systems tend to fall apart in a remote working environment. At Upwork, in our sales team, we created a buddy system. I know Alexa, who is on the call here from Upwork, who leads the relationship with Insight Partners. She's part of the buddy system where we created peer-to-peer relationships, and they have weekly check-ins. Because let me tell you something, Zoom happy hour is stressful. The research suggests that bringing people together for just another group meeting is not the way to create peer offloading of stress. One-to-one, dyadic relationships are the key. If you're interested in how we created the buddy system, we used a simple Google Doc for people to align with the peer. You can send me an email. My email address is timsanders@upwork.com. That's my name, timsanders@upwork.com. Happy to talk to you about it. But what we noticed right away is that by maintaining that buddy system, we noticed a real lift in the overall spirit, mood, and engagement of the sales group. Here's the last thing. This is a hard thing to do, but it's an important thing to do. As a manager, you need to think more about the individual workplaces for remote workers. Of all the research I've read, of all the things SAS Institute's done, the one thing that really hits me hard is the importance of sunlight on creating a positive mood state at work. SAS Institute used to configure for daylight as much as possible our moving groups on a quarterly basis to make sure that on a rotational basis, they have sunshine. So for example, the remote producer I work with has configured me in front of my window. So as I see you, the light shines in on me. Now, not every employee is going to be able to work in a room with sunlight. But as you think about going back to work, as you think, many of you think about this hybrid workforce of using WeWork or co-working facilities, don't just look for space, look for sunshine, because the research is absolutely clear that that's one of the easiest ways to improve mood state and reduce burnout by design. This is something I personally want to talk to you about before I enter the last part of this presentation. I want to talk to you as individuals about how you can reduce stress. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I focused most of my remarks on how we as leaders can design an enterprise workflow for less stress, but I want to talk to you about it. Meet Sood, Dr. Sood, one of the most brilliant minds in stress management. If you just remember one thing, go read this book, The Mayo Clinic Guide to Stress-Free Living. It's just amazing. I just can't say enough good things about it. Let me just give you the greatest hits from that book. 90% of all stress is cognitive, and it's within your control to manage. 90%. It's true. Your brain is wired to escape the present moment and go into what he calls the default mode of mind wandering. Right now, he says, there's about 100 open files in your brain at any given time. And the stress you likely feel right now is moving from file to file to file. He talks about those dark holes, the rumination that we do, going into things we regret from the past or things we fear in the future. As a matter of fact, a leading life coach says of the 7 personality types most likely to experience burnout, the ruminator may be the biggest type. And we've all become ruminators over the last year, falling out of the present moment. I want to give you a simple exercise right now that can help you be in the present moment, because if we teach people to be present, they have a lot less stress. Now, here's a simple example I've learned from a researcher. I want you to do this. I want you to look around the room that you're in right now and identify everything that's red. Just do that. Just take a second. Follow me on this. I'm doing it. There's red in the clock I'm using to stay on time. There's red in the stop share. There's a little red over here in my guitar, and my Valentine's Day card my wife gave me that I keep on my desk. It's got red in it. It's got a red heart. And I think that's all the red in my room. Have you done this? You've just visually grounded yourself in the present moment. There are so many ways that we can think more in the present, but what Dr. Sood says is that every experience has two components: attention and interpretation. I've been talking so far about one of the components that he focuses on in reducing stress. That's attention training. You've got to train your attention to be focused on the present, focused on the work at hand, and in an environment with multiple distractions, to focus on the joyful components as opposed to the stressful components. Because I've learned a lot that attention is something through practice you can absolutely direct. I find myself using Dr. Sood's technique of looking at negative thoughts in my mind as writing on a whiteboard that I could simply take an eraser and dismiss, resetting myself to the work on hand. The second thing he talks about is the importance of interpretation. In other words, is this an opportunity? Is this a threat? Oftentimes people mistake news as bad news when all it is get busy news. Our ability to think about where we point our attention and how we interpret events gives us the power to dramatically reduce stress. Here's the last thing I want to talk about. How can we design an enterprise to give people more energy? There's basically 5 things. The first one, I want to talk a little bit about this, is a shortened work week. Okay, so there's an article, you're going to get a link to it, was in Time Magazine. They talked about Del Sol in Spain, who started an experiment creating a 4-day work week, in this case, taking off Fridays. It led to a 30% drop in absenteeism among software workers. The government of Spain is now studying this. They're not alone. Microsoft Japan, Shopify in Canada, Unilever, New Zealand are all studying various formats of a 4-day work week, either with Monday, Friday, or in some cases Wednesday off. And through rapid testing, this may be a unique value proposition where they get the increased productivity, not a decrease in productivity, and at the same time, they also create a less likelihood for burnout. That's one idea. The second one is personal time off coaching. The research I just read yesterday indicates that in 2020, 49% of people reported they took less time off, okay? Almost 40% said they took no time off. We have got to start coaching people to take personal time off. Look at this data on the decrease in vacations in 2020. It fell off a cliff. PTO coaching requires a lot more than you might think. PTO coaching could require having someone on point to do research on opportunities during the pandemic for a person to get out based on their current location, and then customizing this across the workforce. We might want to incentivize people to do it, making it a condition of taking on a hard project that they've had enough PTO before they take the project on. We've got to absolutely take them out of the loop of email, Slack notifications when they attempt to take PTO, much like SAS Institute did. We need to celebrate people that have taken PTO, just like we celebrate people that got their vaccine. We need to take this on as a responsibility, because personal time off is the #1 way people can recharge. We need to coach people on boundaries. We're doing a lot of that at Upwork, teaching people turn off at 5, close the door, leave your work behind. And as we coach them on that, we notice they're taking more time off. We coach them not to work over the weekends. So we got to coach people on having better boundaries, turning off Slack, turning off notifications, etc. We need to employ more ad hoc recognition. Ad hoc recognition is when you create a way for people to instantly recognize outcomes. Adobe has a variety of ways they do it. They have Trailblazer certificates that back in 2008 and 9, right before they really hit their stride with what Professor Scott Galloway calls rundles, these reoccurring revenue bundles that put Adobe back on top. If you remember, they had a real crisis when Flash and other key products were no longer integrated into the Apple ecosystem. They kept themselves refreshed during those challenging times by creating instant recognition opportunities for peers to recognize each other's. I've also noticed that real successful leaders today are very good at immediately recognizing a successful outcome, being highly specific in the recognition to help people understand the impact they made. So our one-on-ones need to help people understand the impact that they made. I'll make one last suggestion, and that's logotherapy. Logotherapy is giving people a sense of purpose and meaning. Logotherapy actually started out with Dr. Viktor Frankl. This is one of my favorite books. Like, if you're just going to read a book to improve your point of view, read this book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl survived concentration camps. He survived because he had a purpose. And the purpose was to write this book and to bring his research on logotherapy to the world. That's what he said kept him alive while many people that were alongside him died of hopelessness. And he learned that where there is meaning, there is no suffering. And it's really important for you as a leader to create a culture where people understand their purpose and understand that their work has impact, that their work has meaning. I talk to people all the time, you got to review your fan mail. This was a conversation I had with Senator McCain years ago after an unsuccessful bid for president. He talked about himself feeling pretty burned out. I asked him, yeah, but I bet you got a lot of fan mail, but that's not what his staffers put in front of them. All they put in front of them was the complaints and fires he needed to put out. If you read your fan mail, you realize how much more impact you have. It's time to increase the cadence of talking to your team members about values and the mission that you're on. At Upwork, our mission is to create economic opportunities so people have better lives. The 16 million freelancers and contractors on our platform. We've talked about it more in 2020 than ever. It gives us a sense of meaning and energy. You've got to absorb the enthusiasm of a newbie. Newbies are so cute for the first few months, aren't they? They're so excited and grateful to have a job. Absorb that enthusiasm. You'll understand the meaning of your work. And the last thing I'll say is double down on mentoring peers. Right now, I have 6 mentees inside Upwork, and I get great purpose and meaning from it. As a matter of fact, it is the antidote for me when I feel burned out. And I learned that from my mentor, the late, great Stanley Marcus Jr., son of the founder of Neiman Marcus. And he said multiple recessions happen in his life. Luxury clothing goes first. And he experienced a lot of burnout and stress. And he said, the more stressed I was about time, the more time I gave to people as a mentor, because the feedback loop gives you this spirit and this sense of meaning that absolutely recharges you from the inside. And with that, we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to stop. I just want to thank you for being here today, because you have this ability to affect thousands and thousands of people that are struggling with mental health right now, simply because they want to do a good job and they're working in literally the most uncertain environment of our lives. So with that, I'd love to open it up to some Q&A. I see one here in the queue. What does a healthy and balanced relationship with your workplace look like? I like the question. The relationship with your workplace is that it adds value to your life, including your family life, versus subtracts value to your life, including your family life. So you take the money off the table and you ask the question, is the job giving you more purpose than it gives you stress? I think it's a simple way to think about it. That question's been asked a lot. When I interviewed Christina Maslach about it, that's what she said, is it's really about the whole add value, subtract value. And if you don't know, for those of you that have partners in your life, just ask them how they feel about your job. And that's a pretty accurate lens about the relationship you have with work. Could you take a moment to address the mental load that parents experience? Oh, wow, this is a good point. So remote workers, we found that when you looked at late stage burnout, where it was critical and producing absolute health issues, like where it couldn't be reversed, people that were had kids were 100% more likely than people that were unmarried to have that fourth stage irreversible level of burnout. So one of the things we have to do is we have to also create some segmentation around hours and workload to make sure that we're giving back time proactively to those that have kids, because they're usually having to educate them at home or experiencing stress. The research says that their sense of gratitude and engagement more than makes up for the productivity. And if you ask John Chambers, former CEO at Cisco, he would tell you, and I say this very carefully, parents are great managers, he said, because they have the nurturing DNA that they bring to work. So we need to reward them accordingly and also recognize their increased workload. Given how busy you must be, how do you find time for so much mentoring? I say no to a bunch of stuff that's not as important to mentoring. I reject 6 meeting requests a week, and we do micro meeting slacks instead. Mr. Marcus said, you'll find so much purpose in mentoring, you'll fight for those hours to spend with other people. So we need to empower people just to say no. Got another question. How can we help employees who've been locked down for months? Any ideas on activities, coaching, or policies? I love the buddy system. I think it's a great one. I think this idea of vacation finder, to have somebody in workplace locate based on where people live, the closest places for vacation. For example, I live outside of Phoenix, Arizona. So a location finder could tell me, Tim, you can go to Sedona. It's got a really low risk rate. There's a lot of great outdoor activities that really peers with what I like to do. So just be more thoughtful about how can you design through a recommendation engine and support levels, things people can do based on their location. I love that question. Last one I'll answer is we're at time. How might we help leaders in our organization who may not follow these principles boast about late night and Saturday work? We need to shun them. We need to confront them. We need to do research internally that does a load offset between managers that recognize work-life integration and those that don't. We need to really go after specifically late night and email weekends by ignoring the emails. That's something that my old boss, Mark Cuban, said the simplest solution to somebody that's got a really bad habit of emailing you at 2 in the morning is to never answer their email. Now, if that's your boss, it's hard to do. But as leaders, I think you need to really counsel and coach people, because you can work offline and send everything. I did a study with Pitney Bowes, 30,000 people on email etiquette. Do you know that your employees would rather receive 35 action items on Monday morning than 1 action item every 17 minutes starting Friday night at 5:30? So we've got to, as leaders, talk about workplace culture in terms of people being able to turn off. Just go Google SAS Institute, best place to work. You'll read about this. They made it part of their leadership culture. They made it part of how they reviewed managers at the end of the year. So I think there's a great way we can do it. I know we're at time, Christina. Thank you so much. My email address again is timsanders@upwork.com. If you'd like to bring this presentation to your extended group, we're here for you. Upwork appreciates the partnership with Insight Partners and all the portfolio groups. We're here to help you go faster, go further, and help your people manage the load and thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. This was wonderful. As I said earlier, we will be sharing a recording of this session via email, also a link to Upwork's partner profile on the Go platform so you could take advantage of the Insight discount. That's it from us today. Have a wonderful day. Thank you again, Upwork team.